Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to what should be an interesting and instructive panel session. We've got here experts who will be discussing this topic from the perspective of the portfolio SME investee companies, from the perspective of the venture capital investors, as well as the development finance institutions perspective. I'll let them quickly introduce themselves so that when they are speaking, you get a sense of the perspective from which they are speaking. And we'll start from the far left.
My name is Robert Zegers. I work with the African Development Bank, active in investments in the financial sector, dedicated to funding for SMEs through financial institutions, funds, equity, debt to financial institutions, and so forth. Technical assistance as well.
Hello, my name is Mamadou Touré. I'm the founder and CEO of the Ubuntu Capital Group, which is an investment company focusing on investing and providing technical assistance to young SMEs and also helping them move from early venture towards development and growth stage with another fund that will help them take to true growth stage. So we look at a disruptive way of funding entrepreneurs by providing them with the adequate ecosystem that could accelerate their growth while mitigating the risk that is allocated in their environment.
My name is Boldewijn Sloet. I'm a manager and co-founder of managing partner and co-founder of Africa Tech Ventures. We're raising a fund at the moment. We're based in East Africa, so the fund will be also focused on that region as well as on West Africa.
My name is Kago Kagichiri, and I'm the co-founder of a company called Eneza Education. We do mobile learning in 3 countries in Africa with about 2 million students. And the way we think about education is that students should use whatever devices they have. So we provide interactive learning all the way from SMS to web browsers.
My name is Maurizio, Caio. I'm the managing partner of TLcom Capital. We're a straightforward, normal, non-impact venture capital firm. And we're based in Nairobi, Lagos, and London. We've been doing this for many years out of London, and over the 5 years we've been operating in Africa, and we're now closing a fund that is dedicated to African entrepreneurs.
I'm Grant Brooke. I'm CEO of Twiga. Twiga is a replacement marketplace for small and medium-sized vendors who would traditionally use informal markets. We give them ordering platforms to deliver the stock directly to their shop at better prices and better quality. We're now the largest seller of bananas and potatoes and other staple products in Kenya.
Okay. And I'm Kehinde. I'm a commercial lawyer. I'm a partner in the law firm of Banwo and Ighodalo. It's a leading commercial law firm with offices in Nigeria. So today we are going to be discussing a unique subset of the SME space, and that's the startups that are in the fast business growth area that deploy technology and leverage on technology for structuring business transactions. It's a relatively new development, and it's gradually shaping the way businesses are done, and it will be useful for us to get insights from the experts. And I'll start from Kago. From your experience, do SMEs provide an opportunity for scalable investments in Africa?
Yeah, I believe so, especially SMEs that are leveraging technology like Grant and myself. So our business model is that for a very small fee, as low as 10 US cents, we can charge customers and corporates to then disseminate an unlimited amount of interactive learning to the users. So as I said, we've reached 2 million users in Kenya alone, 1.2 million of who have come in just the last year. So once we tweaked our model, we found that the business has taken off. And I believe it's been 5 years of learning, but right now we're definitely looking like a VC-ready investment. We've had investment from a number of VCs, but really we're able to see the scale that's coming from really being able to market. And I know Grant as well, leveraging mobile platforms is really a strong cause for investment, especially if you're using technology.
Okay. Let's hear from Grant. You're a promoter of an SME based in Kenya. What's your business model, and how do you think that's impacted by the venture capital space?
Yeah, so 96% of food and FMCG products in Kenya and other African markets move through small and medium-sized road shop, small kiosks and outlets like that. Those proprietors would walk to large-scale informal markets, buy their stock, and walk it back to their shop in the past. What we do is get them platforms to place their orders, and then by law of large numbers, collect all those orders, lower price to get them better quality. The reason VC is important in doing this is it hasn't been done before. So there's a lot of trial and error in building a company like this. There's been a lot of mistakes over the past 2 years, and there's a lot of innovation. But there's a huge reward if you get to the end. So bananas themselves are 2.5% of consumer spending in Nairobi, the same as the telco market. If you can crack that, it's a great opportunity. But you need VC as an instrument, separate from debt or private equity, to have the space and the time to get to solve those problems.
Okay. I think we will now hear from the investor's perspective. Mamadou, is there really a sizable SME space from the venture capital's perspective? What are your thoughts?
Yes, I think more than ever, there's a sizable SME venture space. If you look at the market today, most of the greatest potential is coming from young companies, right? So the latest example was the upbringing of the mobile telecommunication, as it was mentioned, that paved the way from significant opportunities, not only for developers, but also for market makers. For instance, because of the mobile technology, you've seen solar home systems growing significantly with the likes of Mkopa, persistent energy, etc., because it allows to leapfrog and to leverage on technology to provide new services. Beyond that, even if you look at the history of investment in Africa, those who have risen to be the largest market caps or companies today were born less than 20 years ago, right? If you take Naspers, even if you take Dangote Group on the cement side, if you take Airtel, MTN, etc., we're talking about a 20-year lifespan. The question is, the reason why those industries rose is because the ecosystem was adequate. The main reason, for instance, that telecommunication industry soared post-90s and early 2000 is because commonly across most African states, there's been a licensing program and a reform of the framework of the telecommunication system that actually allowed to actually such a takeoff. And basically, if you look at the growth, at the life cycle of a company, towards growth stage, most PE funds are focusing on the growth stage. And the challenge you're facing today is that you have more supply of capital than actual very good company at growth stage. And it leads to a inflated cost of acquisitions and challenges in exit, right? So on the other side, on what at early and venture stage, they have the largest bulk of corporates, right? Young SMEs, etc., who struggle to actually find capital and venture capital. So the African market is actually not structured at all like the Silicon Valley market, where at each stage from early to venture to development to growth, you have clouds of investors that are available to take you from one stage to the next one. While in Africa, the cloud is actually at the end of the life cycle, and therefore most PE funds even have a problem themselves finding a good pipeline. So somehow you need people ahead of the curve, right, who help prepare those companies to get to growth stage. And I think the potential and the opportunities for venture capital in Africa is bigger than ever, yes.
Okay. Let's get perspective from Robert. How do deal origination strategies differ across the various regions in Africa? What are your thoughts on this?
Deal flow origination from an investor perspective as the AFDB, and of course is one side of the envelope, and the other side is the deal flow generation for venture capital companies. And I think, as was already mentioned, firstly there are a lot of very good opportunities thanks to the technology. I think that has been said as well, and it is shown also to some of the the entrepreneurs that we have here around the table. Technology currently is an enabler for in all sectors in Africa, whether it's education or health or logistics or transport, in the financial sector, in the agricultural sector, to promote and to create efficiencies in the value chains. And I think this is basically the angle that we see, and this is in all countries in Africa. It's not only in the usual hubs like in Lagos or in Nairobi. We see that there are plenty of opportunities everywhere, and simply because everybody is connected in Africa through Android-type phones and other technologies. And this creates huge opportunities, and we see that also in terms of the venture capital companies that are currently emerging and they're approaching us almost on a daily basis. We find that there's a lot of experienced persons from African nationals that may have obtained experience in Europe or in the US, and they want to come back to Africa. They see that there's an opportunity, and they want to capture that opportunity, and they're willing to establish back in their home countries, in countries like Liberia or Sierra Leone or many other countries. And they are actively preparing for a deal flow and that they want to invest in. And of course they come to us to see if we can help them in realizing the opportunity. So I think, and from our side, but maybe we can talk about it later, of course, we want to see how we can best help them to actually realize the opportunity that we think exists.
Okay. Let's try to put it in a bit more perspective. Boldewijn, what are the key demand sectors, areas of interest for investors?
Well, I think Robert mentioned the different sectors. We look at very broadly across all the what we call essential services like healthcare and education are there, but also agriculture and financial services. So the way we look at sectors is that we have a technology lens on looking at businesses, and that makes us look very broadly across different sectors, but we also see that progress in one can have a very catalytic effect. In one sector can have a very catalytic effect on other sectors. For example, well, of course the pay-as-you-go energy is a very good example. It's an energy access story, but it's been made accessible through the use of mobile money and the likes. Similarly, there are fintech applications that improve agricultural practices, etc. So we take a fairly wide sector approach at the early stage. Also because there just isn't enough deal flow to be too specific in your focus.
Okay. Maurizio, are we really seeing a new wave of innovation led by African tech-based companies?
Yeah, I think we need to put things a little bit in context. When we look at how much venture capital has been invested last year in Africa, the estimates are between 300 and 400 million. This morning we were seeing the amount invested in the US in the first quarter. It's 16 billion, 1/6. So we need to remember that this is T with zero for venture capital in Africa. And so we need to make sure that we know what is the focus, the uniqueness. And the uniqueness has to do fundamentally with some global leadership that Africa is developing in leveraging the high penetration of mobile phones with the low penetration and the vast underserved market that are not technology. I think M-Pesa is a little bit of the general rehearsal for mobile-enabled something else. But the big underserved market are the something else, the ones that we give for granted in other markets. So I think the wave of innovation is not necessarily on the technology side, because these are technologies that are very reliable, and global capital should understand that Africa is one of the places in the world with the lowest technology risk. But there's a lot of innovation on the business side. So people like Kago and Grant are fundamentally reinventing traditional sectors And that's where the innovation is. Now, I think that also the other side with technology is that we have been hearing a lot about the emerging middle class, but still the vast majority of demand in Africa is low income. And the beauty of technology is that allows you to develop business models with very low cost positions that become profitable when you serve low pricing environments. So it's about the verticals that are underserved, and technology can help reinvent, but also technology allows an acceleration of access to the stuff that people really need. So we don't need more mobile phones, but we need better access to healthcare, and that is something that venture capital can pursue because has an ability to take the risk, as Grant was saying, of making mistakes in pursuit of large companies that serve large markets.
Okay. I'll come back to you, Mamadou. What do the typical African SME venture companies look like, really?
Yes, it's interesting to hear the comparison that my colleague just mentioned between the $400 million invested last year in VC in Africa and the $16 billion for a quarter in the US. Yes, those markets are not comparable, and Africa has a lot to catch up with. But I think we need to put things in perspective, right? Most SMEs that we've come across actually have generally solid entrepreneurs, right? That do have, market potential. Clearly, they generally lack 4 other major things. And this, you see it across all of them, even the brightest and strongest potential. Yes, access to capital is one, and that's what is provided in the US. But in Africa, you have to work 4 times harder because it's not just access to capital. It's skills development, second, access to market, third, and policy advocacy framework, right? So when you look at the Silicon Valley ecosystem, you do have, beyond funders, you have people who work on policy in an efficient way, right? And you have connectors that brings you in and links you to some key guys. Now, the real problem here is, and that's how we've structured our investment vehicle through a dual model, right? One that would have, which is called a Sustainable Enterprise Agency that does advocacy, right? That does market linkages and skills development through a blended finance model next to a VC fund that actually deploys the capital, but now you benefit from the whole ecosystem that really helps you grow and go beyond the Death Valley of SMEs. And I think that's really where we're taking a pioneer position. It's basically like, when you make an investment and you just hope that everything else around the ecosystem will fix itself. It doesn't happen in Africa, right? So somehow we need to take that step back and basically work with the entrepreneurs and with his environment to clear the way for him, right? And it's technically like rugby. You have the guy who runs, and then you have people of American football, if you will, who pushes people coming in their way. And I think the ecosystem has not been given enough attention. People succeed despite of the ecosystem, in spite of the ecosystem. In America, they succeed thanks to the ecosystem. And I think in that sense, the joint approach is really what will enable. I made the example earlier, with the mobile telecommunications, right? Now, if you take the case even on the payment space, right? So the case of M-Pesa, for instance, why hasn't it been able to scale the same way as it was successful in Kenya? It wasn't because the technology wasn't good. The technology is very good. But first, M-Pesa, Safaricom benefited from leader position in the market, 80% market share. But more importantly, they were allowed to do what they were doing, in spite of the banks. So it makes a big difference, the ecosystem. So I think, working with AFDB, what they've done also with, the Boost Africa with EIB is exactly that. How do you provide the right technical assistance and the funding to actually enable those funds to grow? And 4 key elements. If we work on that, we should be fine. And last point, I met there was a competition here, and we come across just a super bright guy. He's doing Li-Fi, right? So Internet over Light. So there are 4 people in the world doing that today. One is here. When you compare, and we're looking at investing in that company, right? Because you can send data 30 times faster, right, than on Wi-Fi. Now, the guy did his PhD in Europe. He spent 3 years working on that, and now you have 4 companies in the world doing it. Now, it doesn't have the same level of support than the 3 other companies. Now, we're working and giving him not only the exposure, but working also with government, etc., to make sure that this can actually take off. It's probably one of the next big success stories, and not only in Africa, globally. But
Okay.
yes.
Okay. Since you've identified some challenges, I think it would be good to hear from the SMEs, starting with Kago, and then we'll come to grants. So what are the key challenges you experience in raising capital and any other non-financial challenges?
Yeah, so I mean, when we started, we were mainly funded by angels and impact funds, if you will. And what we found from that is that it was a very, okay, here are some milestones, how are you measuring your impact, let's write you a check. And as long as we are sort of hitting that impact, then we were sort of good in their books. The problem with that is that it created challenges for us. So we found that at one point when we wanted to pivot our business models, which would change what the impact is looking like, you already have these agreements that are tied to what you're doing as a core proposition. And so what that did to us is that we had to sort of run 2 businesses, one which is working on the new business model and one which is still catering to sort of the impact agreements that we had. The other challenge that we were finding is in the space, just like Mamadou said, is that because we are a mobile pay-as-you-go service, the problem with that is there are some countries, for example, that don't have pay-as-you-go. So we find that the mobile telecom market is sort of sort of emerging in the next 2 years. I believe all the telcos will be sort of at the place where we can integrate with them. But right now you find that there's a lot of problems with how the mobile companies are working with SMEs, which sort of we have refined on how to work and create a business case that allows them to do that, coming down from about 20 months of integration to now about 1.5. The other part is the regulations. So I've worked doing platforms for government before, and I know how much bureaucracy there is there. So when we started Eneza, basically, we knew we had to have an approach that doesn't involve government. So we'd create our content and then have it later authorized by the government bodies, because the regulations around what can happen in the schools, no mobile phones in classrooms. At one point, we'd got about 100 schools to add our platform onto the fees, and 3 months later, the minister, banned such a service, even though parents wanted to pay for it. So in those ways, we've sort of taken those challenges and allowed them to be a stepping stone. I feel like with every really harsh government regulations, it only makes our proposition even faster. But also there's the regulatory side of the communications authorities about what you're allowed to deliver on SMS in Zimbabwe. You're not allowed to charge with airtime. So we're seeing a lot of that. But I think once we get it right, we're seeing that all the markets that we're in right now, 3 and 7 by the end of next year, will be able to make themselves in about 2 years, because now we have a really good understanding of that market. When it comes to financing, obviously with the VCs and PEs, we're finding, education, especially in education, a lot of investors require, pre-revenue. I think that a lot of other sectors are sort of given leeway to become profitable after a while, but education, I don't know what the reason is for that, but we find it's extremely strict on what you can do, mostly because people are looking at brick and mortar and not really technology. So with that, the reason why we want to move into the VC space, and we already have 2 VCs invested in us, one in 2014 and one last year, is because VCs are extremely hands-on. Some VCs have, really grown our business, bringing in value, helping us sort of with unit economics, even pushing the mobile telcos, which the impact space was not able to do. So I think the challenge then is finding, a certain investor who completely understands the sector and can really help you, because otherwise then if you sort of broaden, like you get a VC who invests in all sectors, then there is a challenge with understanding businesses like ourselves, especially those that work in mobile telecommunications.
Okay. Any additional thoughts from you, Grant?
Yeah, I can say that a lot of companies look strange in the seed stage. So 24 months ago, I was running around with a PowerPoint presentation about how bananas were the access to every retail shop in Kenya. And I think seed level VCs would find that nuts. There's a guy talking about just distributing bananas in Kenya. But there was a purpose to that. We could layer on product after product once you crack bananas. And now Series A raising has become a lot easier for us. But you still don't get the luxury of burning through a lot of cash on unit economics and things of the sort that you would get in the West. So Uber loses 40% on every ride by their own unit economics. If we didn't make a profit on bananas, people would go haywire in the Series A stage. So with our backers now, we're having conversations about profitability before you get to Series B, these kind of things. When you're dealing with a market that is $2 billion on fresh fruit and veg just in Nairobi, when you add FMCG and other products on top, a huge addressable market, but there just isn't the luxury to burn a ton of cash overtaking that market. And I think that's just a reality that we're going to have to stick with for a while.
Okay. Oftentimes we get the impression that the problems are really from experienced by the SME companies, but it would be good to find out if there are also constraints from the side of the investors and VCs. So I'd like to hear from Boldewijn and then Maurizio.
Okay. Well, first of all, as Grant mentioned, one of the constraints in investing in SMEs is that you need to throw out the window your expectation of profitability anytime soon, which is obviously a different level of comfort that you need to have. The other thing is that because companies are small, the pipeline of potential companies is very wide, and so you need to look at a lot of businesses before you can pick your investments, and then you've done relatively small investments, and there's still a lot of support that needs to be given. As Kago mentioned, we invested through a Safaricom venture fund in his company last year, 9 months ago, and it was a relatively small investment, but we spent every week sitting with him, going through like the fundamentals of his business, and sort of tracking very basic things like organizing your finances, putting a budget together, doing things that possibly at later stage investments you wouldn't expect to have to do. We like doing it. They've gone from 15,000 paying users 9 months ago to 150,000 this month, and if everything goes on track, in about 2 years they'll reach 1.5 million. That's the kind of growth that's possible, and that you have to be willing to see. It's not easy, but if you have an understanding of the market, those companies we firmly believe are there.
Okay.
Yeah, I would add that from a venture capital perspective, when you look at a company, the question that we ask is not what can go wrong, because at this stage many things can go wrong, quite honestly, but rather if everything works, how big can this be? That's the thing. We're trying to build a portfolio of things of companies that can be very ambitious. We know that we will lose a number of companies. We have to be left with companies that have a sizable value generation potential. And so when we look at the entrepreneurs, when we have initial conversations, we see the signs of the available capital and the impact that that capital has had on the mentality of the entrepreneur. So until now, impact money has been the predominant money available, which is very useful. It's slightly different from venture capital. There's different emphasis on impact versus financial return. There's a different expectation of return. But fundamentally, we see entrepreneurs that have an anxiety to get to cash break-even, which is good and legal, but it doesn't help in building a company that can be a massive value generation. So we usually have conversation of the side, but what is your full potential? What can be done to actually grow faster and larger? So I think that one of the challenges for us is to reassure the entrepreneur that he can give us the real version of what he has in mind, not something that is manufactured to intercept the only source of money that was available so far.
Okay.
And that is a little bit of a cultural change, but one that is very important. And again, we all are trying to make money and have an impact, right? It's just a matter of different emphasis, but the way we look at companies like Eneza or Twiga is that, you know, if finally these are companies that have business plans that have hundreds of millions in revenues of tens of millions in EBITDA. Where are you guys, right? Where are the other entrepreneurs? Why are they saying it's going to take me 5 years to have 7 million of revenues? Algebra tells us that doesn't help, right?
Yeah.
So I think that is the challenge, but I must say that if you look at 3 companies, you don't find them. If you look at 100, like just Boldewijn was saying, you will find a few. And the good news for Africa is that it's exactly the same percentage as Tel Aviv, London, or Palo Alto, right? You look at 100 companies and you invest in maybe 1 or 2. So,
Okay. Okay. Now we've heard from the SMEs and we've gotten some perspectives from the investor. I'd like to hear from Robert. Apart from investing, how can DFIs be of help in addressing some of these challenges that have been posed by the previous speakers?
Well, I think the message that we have heard so far is very clear. In venture capital companies that want to work with investee companies, with potentially high growth companies that do something that is new in the market, they need to be very, very involved, and they need to understand the market very well and the specific sector in which this company operates very well. It's much more than just pumping money into it, and it's particularly clear in these early stage companies. And I think some of the venture companies, they are able to provide that. They have the market knowledge, they have the knowledge, intimate knowledge of what the enterprises need to succeed. And as was earlier mentioned, they also operate in difficult enabling environments, and obviously those environments also need to be addressed. And what we've seen in Africa, I think, is certain ecosystems that are more enabling because they have strong networks and connections between support providers, and that are those are partly venture capital providers, but they're also incubators and accelerators, even the government agencies that can assist and if they come together, if there is networks between those agencies that function, then we see that entrepreneurs can also thrive. And so venture capital providers of financing and a lot of hand-holding are playing an important but not only role in that. But they will succeed much better if they're operating in a good environment. So our role, I guess, is also to ensure that we support the creation of such environments in other countries beyond Lagos and Nairobi and Johannesburg, such that venture capital providers can operate there and can work more closely together with incubators, accelerators, with the broader enabling environment and can make the difference. And we are at this stage working on a program, it was alluded to earlier, it's called Boost Africa, which we are working on together with the EIB, which is trying to actually address these various constraints and to become an investor in a wide range of venture capital providers, but at the same time work closely with them to work on enabling environment and to address also the capacity building gaps, even at the level of the venture capital providers, because as I said in the beginning, there's a lot of providers that are coming back to a lot of experts that are coming back to Africa, but we need to see that they really have this intimate skills and knowledge of the sector, of the entrepreneurs, of the local market, and we'll have to build their capacities as well to be able to engage. And so it's also for us, it's much more than providing capital into the sector. But we're working on a program for that, and we hope that will also bring in other DFIs, investors in due course, so that we start bringing capital to this segment, which we believe has a lot of potential and is severely underfunded, I would say at this stage.
Okay. We're fast. Okay.
Maybe I'll just add a point
Okay.
I think Robert makes a very important point that tends to be overlooked in general is, especially in Africa, it takes a village to raise a child. You probably have heard that expression. And it's very much more relevant when you talk about a venture capital company, company at VC stage, right? So what really makes the difference is, we all barely know about, investing, but it's about taking a small firm at VC stage and bring all the relevant networks and parties together to take it there. And even in our own model, we have integrated an entity which name is Africa 2.0. I'm sure some of you know about it, that gathers several hundreds of leaders, of young leaders across 34 countries in Africa that are taking part to this process, so that whenever you work with a company and bring whichever skills that we mentioned, whichever advocacy, etc., you want to be able to create the right connections for them. And that's how you skip time. And one last point also, I think we should avoid bringing back the copy and paste model of the VC, or like we did with PE format, to Africa, because initially the private equity format was designed in the Western world for a mature liquid market. And we could see today the main challenges that PE funds are having in terms of exiting, etc., because the maturities are not adequate to the time it takes. And I think when we look at VC, and you were talking, earlier, you started your company 5 years ago, and you had Series A, right? In the US, you'll be at Series A after 9 months of proof of concept, right? So if you have a VC fund that has a 5-year maturity, then they wouldn't have made money with you, because they would be able to exit. And I think we need to really look at how those VC funds are structured and how much time they allow. And the way we've kind of tried to go around this problem was to create two funds. One VC and another one that has a first right of refusal for the best performing, to take them through development and growth stage, so that there is an horizon of growth of 10, 15 years for those companies. And I think we really need to put those links together. It's like, okay, once I'm done with VC, how do I exit? The stock markets are not that liquid, and most of the PE won't look below $20 million. So who do you exit to? So, and that's why the strategy, putting the VC in place and working with those companies in plugging them into ecosystem and linking them to bigger firms who may want to bring them into their realm to take them at a longer stage, is a much better value proposition.
Okay. Boldewijn, what do SMEs need to kind of do to reduce the risk of failure?
Well, I think the interesting comments around ecosystem and that have been mentioned are definitely, part of the answer to reducing failure. So if you talk about ecosystem, there's the accelerators, the incubators, and then a lot of other sort of support mechanisms. But one of the other things that wasn't really mentioned yet is that corporates, I think, also hold a potential, and not in every case, but in some cases, a potential key to making these companies succeed. Kago is a great example, but there are many others, where if you look at Safaricom, in Kenya it's known for M-Pesa, but they are also, they own about 75 to 80% of the market in retail customers. So as an access to market channel, it's great. If you can make that linkage, the potential for a startup to succeed is vastly increased. Kago's target market overlaps with 14 million Safaricom customers. If he reaches 10% of those, he has a really big business, and it's very achievable once you get the telco on board. The same with banking. So fintech companies, all these fintech players are looking to pilot their ideas within a bank. If you can make those links in a meaningful way for the banks, you can really massively increase the success rate of these early stage companies, and also add a lot of value. Now, of course, there's a tension between that, right? Because startups are also rightfully paranoid that big companies will run off with their ideas. So, in some cases it doesn't work. But in case of Kago, they've already had a signed agreement for 4 years. Safaricom is a fantastic partner to them. We hope that will stay like that in the future. He's looking now at other markets and partnerships with other telecoms. But given that the telecoms hold the key to a lot of, to markets, to infrastructure and all of that in Africa, that's part of the unique ecosystem, the lack of legacy systems, but the telcos kind of hold a lot of keys, and the banks do the same for some of the fintech solutions. So it's not that we're just talking about disruptive businesses who just gonna wipe out the banks or wipe out the telecoms. It's actually that these large existing players can play an important role in increasing the success rate. So part of our role as an investor, we also see is to make these meaningful connections.
Okay. We're gradually running out of time allocated to us. We'd like to take questions from the audience. Okay. Are there any questions? Okay. We'll just allow each of the panelists to kind of round up and summarize, starting from Grant.
Yeah, I think that we need help, basically. I've hung out in the VC startup world in Nairobi now for 8 years and seen an ecosystem develop, seen the first era VC not have the best success, and now more mature VCs come in. And I think there's an art to building a VC-ready business and addressing a large enough market and recruiting a team to do that and a craft to doing all that a lot of the entrepreneurs I see, my colleagues, aren't trained for yet. So if I were to encourage this crowd to kind of do anything separate from making capital accessible to entrepreneurs, it's to help with training my colleagues on what can make a business get to the level now that Twiga is thankfully at, and I know Kago has just kind of cracked this space as well.
I think that the sort of the concluding remark is that I think we have an opportunity now to enter into sort of a little bit of a new phase of venture capital for Africa, just because LPs like Africa Development Bank and others are giving us, the investor, the opportunity to play as if Africa were a normal place like everywhere else. So, this company needs equity, not debt. This company need a commercial approach. These companies need business building a lot more than financing. When you think about a holding period of 5, 7, 10 years, and you do what, 4 or 5 rounds, if you do a lot, that's 5 days in 10 years that are about financing. The rest of the time is about building the business and trying to make more money next year. So I think that it's up to us to capture the opportunity, to work with the entrepreneurs and to demonstrate to as many LPs as possible that this is a way of creating massive value.
Okay, Kago?
Yeah, I think I'll echo Maurizio's words. I think if the conversation shifted for what would this look like, in an ideal situation, I mean, we've proved that, we can reach customers for $0.4 and those customers have a lifetime of about $2. So, really all that's waiting right now is sort of the networking and a really hands-on experience with the investors. And thankfully, we've had that with a few VCs, but definitely, even as we look forward, I'm seeing a lot of other VCs not participating in sort of SMEs. So a lot of the, lack of patience, investing in pre-profit companies. I will also mention we're raising a Series A as well. We've just completed our first close. But again, a lot of the conversations that we have for the second pipeline are coming from impact people who understand the space and understand the need. And the VCs who we are talking to right now are raising funds, so they're not participating, but sort of the other ones are still very rigid on the market. They're looking at Africa as a very hard market, and I think we've proved at this point, and a lot of other SMEs are proving that Africa, rural especially, could be a much bigger market than Africa middle and upper income. And I can say that, that's backed with data. You can see me about that. And I think VCs need to start also looking at these emerging markets and classes of people as the next phase of growth for Africa and capital.
I happily see that a lot of the DFIs and other LPs are currently very seriously looking at venture and have already made some investments like in Maurizio's fund. I would like to say for the people who aren't looking into it yet that the venture train is picking up some steam and highly encourage you to get your feet wet and jump on the train and start also looking at this sector. These two entrepreneurs are both extremely promising, but they're not the only ones. We see a lot of diamonds in the rough that are really worth looking at and investing in. So I'd encourage everyone to take this sector very seriously.
Yes, I would just like to make a small analogy, right? So, traveling around the world and talking to investors, etc., and you hear two things that come all the time. Africa is hard to do business, and Africa is risky, right? Now, I remember I can see one of my former GE colleagues somewhere there. We were discussing a few years ago about the returns, so with some other colleagues in the energy space. And when we discussed, they were in Germany, right? So where we discussed the average IRR, right, on energy deals in Africa over 15 years compared to theirs. So they told us that they were happy with 7-8%, and then they fall off their chair where we're telling them the average IRR returns in energy in Africa was 20 and beyond, right? Yes, it's hard to work in Africa. Yeah, it's risky, but it's about how you structure things, right? As always. And if you take, even my experience at IFC, actually Africa was the biggest returns if you take 1998 to 2012, 28% IRR in investments. And you know on which investments? It was mostly VC, which means with mostly telecoms at the time, right? So it was about structuring risk. And now when you go and see a VC, funds of funds or LPs, and you come with a structure that they're not used to, you tend to hear remark and say it's complex. But remember project finance, it came about 40 years ago, right? It came as a structured device to actually fund projects all across emerging markets. And there's been trillions of dollars spent over this. It always takes a while to shift the mindset towards something new. But we are at the eve today on this continent where this place is about to take off. There's going to be 2 billion Africans in 2040, more literate, more technology savvy, and it's going to be the biggest consumer class globally. 7 out of 10 youth will be from Africa. So from an investment point of view, taking a few more hours to design complexity, it's worth the returns. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I absolutely agree with you. And then Rob?
Yeah, I think I fully agree with that. I think obviously for reasons that we have discussed, the risks may be perceived higher, particularly for those that may be new to investing in Africa. There are certain market-related constraints. On the other hand, the return potential is also much higher. The markets are in many cases not yet mature, and there are significant opportunities to do new things, to do things better, differently, more efficiently. And this can create a lot of development outcomes and positive impact for the communities that those entrepreneurs operate in. And they can also create a lot of jobs and a very good return for the investors. And I think that's what we, from a development finance institution perspective, look at. And our job is basically to crack the nut, to see how we can mobilize funding from ourselves, but from other investors as well, the DFIs, the private sector, in order to work with venture capital providers, seed capital providers, and to create the market supply and to make this the work in Africa, because that's what was missing, I think, so far. The opportunities were there, but the supply side of the financing was largely missing. I think we're seeing indeed a lot of interest now also from DFIs, private sector investors perhaps a little bit less, but we are going to structure mechanisms to bring them on board and so that we can all together invest by de-risking this sector, by also for investors, but also by working with the venture capital providers to build their capacity, as well as to work in the local ecosystems to strengthen those and to sort of undo constraints that exist there. And I think we're going to see a bright future for high growth, innovative SMEs in Africa.
All right, thank you very much. And that's the end of the panel session. Please join me in appreciating the panelists.